is our first virtual conference. So we hope that you get a lot out of this. I like virtual stuff because I can sit back and listen as well as contribute. But my role today is, I believe, a moderator. I don't know what I'm meant to be moderating, but I'm hoping that we just find that things will run smoothly. I'm just getting a lot of chat from Jules. Just one moment. I'm just going to shut Jules up. Right. So basically, the conference is being put on by Narelle and Shannon. So thank you guys for doing all the work getting this organised. And a big thank you to you guys for attending today for your benefits. I'm going to just do a bit of housekeeping. I believe we've got a half-hour break. Is it midday, Narelle?
12:30.
12:30. Okay, so 12:30. We've got a half-hour break. So I'll probably be hanging around here on the Zoom meeting in that half hour if you want to have any questions answered. So we'll have a couple of speakers before lunch, and then we'll have two after, and some question and answers at the end of it. I'm going to say that I'm not a very good public speaker because I hate public speaking, but that's all right. So I'm going to start with where we have been, a little about myself. I think I'm probably one to talk about accessibility and digital accessibility at that, because I've been totally blind since birth. I was born in the 70s, so yeah, we're 70s and 80s sort of focused. I was educated at in both a blind school and in a regular education environment. So I started off in my prep in grade 1 to about grade 4, sorry, at a blind school, and then from then I went to a regular schooling environment. And when Narelle asked me to speak about the history of access, I put my head to it, and I wrote some notes, and basically I didn't want to do a presentation because I felt like this should be a speaking type presentation, because we all like a good story. So the story is basically this. When I was younger, like many children in my group, in my particular age group, we were at that stage where technology was probably at its infant stage. So a lot of people who came before us and people that went to university with disabilities had it pretty hard. And I know exactly what they had to do because I was in that unfortunate era where I had to experience the joys of brailing assignments out, getting the braille, typing the assignments out, hoping that you don't bloody get a mistake on one page or whatever, because if you did, you end up having to rewrite the whole page, and then submitting the assignment. And that's what a lot of people who were older than me had to experience when they wanted to do their university studies or high school studies, to get into uni. They were basically doing a process that would be considerably longer than what their sighted peers were doing. Coming back to the digital access, or but not digital access at that time, to the print access, often that was very difficult because that would mean that that the person needed to get their books transcribed from print to braille, and what happened then, they would they would then have multiple volumes of Braille. So fortunately, I don't have a bookshelf anymore that I could show you, but there were known cases where some people that I knew had whole rooms of Braille books. For example, the Bible, for instance, would be often in 23 or 24 very thick Braille volumes. Just to give in a dictionary, for instance, I had a little Oxford dictionary, which is what you would know as a little pocket dictionary. It would often come out, I think the one I had when I was a child, it was a 17 Braille volume dictionary. Quite a lot to deal with when you're trying to so you had to have a very good memory or stay at home a lot, which I wasn't allowed to do, obviously, because my mum made sure I went to school. So there were so the other aspects were audio cassette. Some people used audio tapes for getting books read or passages of books read out to them. I had to experience this when I was at university because sometimes the Brailling would take some time to get done and transcribed. So it often would rely on volunteer readers to read information out when I was studying. And so you could tell that accessibility was an arduous and sometimes difficult challenge to go through. Now, as I said, I was in the era where things started to improve, and they did. So you all know that we use HTML, which is a markup language. HTML is actually a subset of what you would know as XML, but that's also a subset of SGML, which is a special general markup language. And when I was in my first year at uni, I was studying computer science. I started to realize that there was markup languages. And when, this is in the early 90s, when I was working with some other students who were also totally blind or had low vision, I was able to realize that we should be using markup languages. Now, in a way, I was brought to the attention of markup languages in the 80s because there was a program that I used when I was a child called Braille Edit. And Braille Edit was a program that was on the old Apple IIe's computers. So I know we're predating here, we're going way, way back. But the Apple IIe had a number of programs that allowed blind people to successfully do their jobs. And one of them was called Braille Edit. Braille Edit was actually a suite of programs written by a blind programmer in the 80s by the name of David Holliday, who passed away last year, which I think if that's correct, I think he wrote it. Race.inc is the company. But anyway, he wrote this or developed a suite of programs for the Apple IIe. And what he used was called a print thinker. Now, the reason why he developed that is because Braille and print don't always match up. So when you actually print a piece of paper, one page, you've got to take into consideration font size, whether the letters are bolded, which change their form, etc. And this is all covered today. We're going to be looking at various parts of accessibility and fonts and all that sort of stuff. But when when you do that sort of stuff, you don't know what's going to happen visually. And being a totally blind person, you certainly don't know what's going to happen visually. So he developed a markup language that was very much it was fantastic. It was one of those languages I wish they kept on going with, because you would be able to do you could set up a font size, you could set up the margin lengths and so forth, but you could also do some various changes to the actual attributes of blocks of text. But he also did that so that you could successfully put that into Braille. So with Braille, it's pretty much the same. You know, all the dots are the same size. So Braille's a combination of 6 dots, and each letter is a different combination of those 6 dots. So in some cases, we now use 8 dots on a Braille display, which gives us more character sets. So we can actually do those extended ASCII characters and work with those. So when we got to the 90s, there were various markup languages starting to take form. One of them you may be aware of is TeX or LaTeX. LaTeX is actually used quite a lot with mathematics and in science literature. So, and what that does is it allows us to actually write up in a text editor math notation, science notation, and even people have used it for literary material to mainly work with other languages. And LaTeX uses what they call font libraries to produce the font or the print output. And now with LaTeX and TeX, you can actually output those into PDF format, PDF files. And yes, Narelle, they do come up as marked up PDF files. I just wanted to answer that question because I know Narelle will ask that question. So LaTeX was one of those suites that I started to learn when I was at uni, and basically that led me into I guess, my love for markup languages, because towards the end of my degree, I ended up finding out about HTML, and we didn't have CSS back then, but CSS was certainly in draft form. And it was until when I did my master's that I started playing around with CSS and styles and so forth. So yes, we certainly have allowed for the improvement in accessibility from that stage. And that work has all been done through the W3C, which we'll be talking about during the day. W3C being a consortium of organizations such as web browsing technologies, companies that deal with servers, technologies, companies that deal with digital access. It's pretty much a broad church these days. So we have now found over the years that as those things have progressed, that digital accessibility has also has grown as well. Or has it? Now that's an interesting question, because some people will say, "Oh, but yeah, back in the 90s, we were pretty much text-based, and we were actually quite good and lucky, and we were able to use our terminals to get into systems, and we were able to hit number 1 for a certain menu and 2 for another menu and all that sort of stuff." And I miss those days too. But we have to go on to include graphical user interfaces. And yes, that was proving to be quite difficult. So in the early to mid 90s, when graphical user interfaces were coming out, as a blind person, they were very difficult to use, or somewhat impossible to use in some cases. But thanks to some very smart developers, some of whom were blind and low vision themselves, we were able to gain access to those environments by the use of screen reading technologies, and then that led to Braille displays, etc. Now, we're going to not just focus on blind and low vision today. That's not the purpose, but I'm speaking on an angle from one particular context, and that's being a person that's lived through as a person who's blind and low vision. I fortunately, when I was at uni, got the chance to work with some researchers in the use of uh, Dragon. You would all know about Dragon, naturally speaking. Um, Back then, it was called Dragon. It became Dragon Dictate at some point. I think we just call it Dragon software. And this is in I think it was around 94, 95. And I was very fortunate to be a part of that research team at Swinburne, where we got to play with Dragon. And if we were talking about technology improving, the speech recognition was one of those areas where, we had back then we had the old Pentiums. I think we had a 486 or 586 back then. The Pentiums were the 586, but the old 486s. We had the Pentiums, and they were just, you would say a sentence, and it would take something like 10 to 15 seconds for it to actually interpret what you said, and then put the text out on the screen, and you would hope that it would be fairly accurate. And we're talking about accuracy of, at best, 45 or 40%. Now, one of the guys I was working with, he was was a person that had cerebral palsy. His speech obviously was slurred, and he was the perfect candidate in my view, and he thought so too, to be one of the testers. And the accuracy with him was quite horrible, because obviously when they developed this, they weren't testing it. And that's the point I'm making here, is that back in the 90s, a lot of people with disabilities weren't actually included in the testing phase of what was being developed. So if something worked really nicely for a blind person, it's probably more luck, or just the fact that they probably did a gradual enhancement on what like a text-based foundation, and it was lucky that they maintained the text components that made it accessible. So that was a bit of a history, and we have now got to the stage where there's a degree of accessibility, but there's still some problems, and problems are mainly now, in my view, attributed to the way that things are developed. There's no reason why a particular site or particular group of pages cannot be accessible. These days, it's got to the stage where if a site is not accessible, it's not because of the tools that have been used or the platform that it's been developed on. It's because of the knowledge that the developer has. And that's why I think you're here, to gain some knowledge in that area that will allow you to actually produce accessible and useful websites. Now, the old adage that says that accessibility is going to cost us more. Yes, it would cost you more if you don't develop it in your software life cycle. If you were to put it in the software life cycle, and accessibility is one of those components that you are always checking off during the developer's life cycle, you should have no problems explaining the costs, because the costs would be quite negligible in the context of making that site completely accessible, compared to actually bolting on something at the end of it to make it accessible because somebody's about to take you to some mediation process or legal process that may happen after that. So that's what we're here, and that's why we're passionate about accessibility. Well, I am, because it's about making people aware of what's actually available right now that is so easy for you to actually access and attain. getting consultants like ourselves is one aspect to it, and that's that's a good thing that is there now. Back in the 90s and even in the 2000s, there were some issues because not everyone understood it. There was very few people, possibly Australia-wide, and you could probably count them on your hand, who really had some knowledge in or practice in accessibility. So now there's quite a few good resources, but some consultants also act in the field that actually will be approachable and will work with developers to make sure that that not only that the sites are accessible, but they're also are usable by people with differing degrees of disability or neurodivergent type requirements. So I think I've spoken enough. What time is it? Oh, good. We've got 3 minutes for questions if you have any, and hopefully we'll get Alan get started. And yeah, so I'll just open up for any questions or while we got time. Hello.
Mark, one question, and I suppose I know the answer. For oh, stop it, Mr. Parker. I heard that voice. What I want to know is when you're out walking and you're trying to find something in the shop or something like that, because that is a form of digital inaccessibility as well, what is the reaction from people around you?
Well, there are a number of pieces of technology that will now, and I didn't touch on the assistive technology side of it. I thought I'd keep to the digital and the web accessibility today, but there are a number of pieces of technology available that allows a person with visual impairment to actually identify objects, and AI is one of those emerging suites of technologies that we should definitely talk about. And later on this afternoon, after we go through all the stuff we have today, we may touch a bit about that because that's an interesting topic. But yeah, things, software packages or wearable glasses that allow access to apps that will read information as you point a camera or face an object. They're all now available and somewhat now getting somewhat affordable. So yeah, it's a bit of an exciting time to be in at this point in time for a person with low vision, because you'll be able to face some sign, and you're going to get an app to read out what the sign is saying. Where before you've always had to rely on people to get tell you where you are, or you have to ask people, okay, where am I? Can you help me to find a particular item? So they're all pretty much well, still possible. I mean, you still will need to ask people for help, but it's getting more and more to the state where you're getting a lot of independence through apps and wearable glasses and so forth.
Yeah. Mark, Adam's got a question. He wants to know, what sort of digital services do you have a tough time using or can't use? For example, are you able to book flights, read the news, purchase groceries online?
That's a good question, Adam. I'm going to say quite boldly that the travel and accommodation sector has a lot to learn about accessibility. I don't know what your thoughts are, Narelle, but as a blind person, when I do, and I've just had to book a series of trips over the last year, and I've had to always rely on some sighted help, whether it's from my partner or a support worker, to actually book my own. What I noticed though, actually, was one of the kudoses I've got to give was an app I haven't used for a long time, but I used it last week because I will be having to travel again. and I'll use this app. It's called Sky Scanner. I don't know if you're all aware of it, but
Mm.
I had a look at it, and it was shocking the last time I had to use it, when I was booking the trip for America.
From Sharon. Oh wow, I don't
and that
even
was
remember that song. So
um,
funny about the type jeans. Send
uh,
the jeans emoji.
I don't know what
Send
that.
the
But
Yeah, you
that
go
was
for it.
that was an app that wasn't really that wasn't a very accessible app. Now, when I used it a few days ago because I want to look at the trips for my next trip, it was really accessible. I was so shocked how dramatically improved it was, that I even had to write to the developers saying, "Well, good on you." Couple little things, but on the whole, I was really happy. And they wrote back saying, "Yeah, we're actually working with a consultant, and we're looking for some testers." And I thought, "Well, sign me up."